She had a 4.0 GPA from one of the best business schools in the country. He had dropped out at 19. She was sitting in his office. He was telling her she had done exceptional work. He owned 4 companies. She helped build one of them. She didn't own any part of it. She had never failed an exam in her life. She had been told, repeatedly, that if she kept doing what she was doing, success would follow. It hadn't. Not the kind she had imagined at 22. What one conversation revealed to her, 6 weeks later, was not a motivational secret. It was a structural one. The education system hadn't failed her. It had trained her perfectly, for exactly the wrong game. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why being excellent at school might be the one thing quietly keeping you from building wealth. Priya Sharma had spent her entire life being told she was exceptional, and she was. Top of every class at school. Scholarship, Dean's List, 2 academic awards at university. At work, the analyst everyone came to when something was complicated. The one whose reports were cited. The one whose presentations got forwarded. The one who stayed late, not because she had to, but because an unsolved problem was something she physically could not leave alone. She joined a consulting firm at 24, got promoted faster than anyone in her cohort, was told at 29 she was on track for partner. She was 32. The partnership hadn't arrived, but something else had. A quiet, specific kind of exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of working too hard, though she worked very hard. The exhaustion of working very hard and feeling, with increasing clarity, that the returns were not matching the investment. She earned a salary most people would call excellent. She had no assets. She had built significant value for clients whose names she couldn't mention. She owned none of it. Every morning she woke up and had to produce again, because nothing she had produced yesterday was still working for her. Meanwhile, the man who ran her performance review had left school at 19, started a business that failed, then another, then another. By his late 20s, he had stumbled into something that worked. By his early 30s, $11 million. He had never been on a dean's list. By every academic measure, Priya would have lapped him effortlessly at any exam. She didn't resent him. She was too precise for that. But she was beginning, quietly, without saying it to anyone, to ask a question she had never been given permission to ask. Why? One Friday evening after a client dinner, after she had sat across a table and delivered a strategy she had privately thought of herself, she walked into a hotel bar alone and sat with a question she didn't have the answer to. What was about to happen next, she hadn't planned for. The bar was quiet. A man in his late 60s sat 2 seats away. Silver hair, dark suit, reading something on paper, not a screen. The particular stillness of someone who has stopped needing to perform busyness. He looked up. Arthur said, "Long week?" Priya almost smiled. Priya said, "Long decade." Arthur said, "You work in strategy?" Priya said, "How did you know?" Arthur said, "The way you're sitting." People who spend their days solving other people's problems carry them differently, like they're still working even when they've stopped. Priya said nothing, because that was exactly what she was doing. Arthur said, "What's the problem you can't solve?" Priya said, "I'm the smartest person in almost every room I walk into, and I'm working for people who aren't." She said it without arrogance. As a fact, one that had stopped making sense to her. Arthur looked at her. Arthur said, "That's not the problem." Priya said, "It feels like the problem." Arthur said, "I know, but it isn't. The problem is what your intelligence was trained to do, and what it was never trained to do. Until you understand the difference, you will keep being the most valuable person in rooms you didn't build." He extended his hand. Arthur said, "Tell me something. In your entire education, how many times were you rewarded for being wrong?" She stared at him, because the answer was, never. Arthur said, "And how many times were you rewarded for being right, inside a system someone else designed?" She opened her mouth and understood, for the first time, that this was the only kind of right she had ever been trained for. What he said next, no professor had ever told her, and it explains everything. Priya said, "That's what education is, being right inside a system." Arthur said, "Exactly. And for most of what life requires, it is excellent preparation. You learn to think clearly, to solve complex problems, to communicate precisely. These are genuine and valuable capabilities. But wealth, the kind that is built rather than earned, requires something education almost never teaches. Because it cannot be tested. It cannot be graded. It cannot be rewarded in a classroom. And so the system simply doesn't include it. Priya said, "What is it?" Arthur said, "The willingness to be wrong. Inside a system you designed yourself. Think about what school actually trained you to do. It gave you a problem. It gave you parameters. It evaluated your answer against a predetermined correct response. Your entire reward system, for 20 years, was built around performing excellently inside structures that other people built. An A-grade student becomes extraordinarily good at that, at reading what the system wants, at delivering it precisely, at optimizing performance within defined constraints. A C-grade student, and I am not romanticizing failure, I am describing a pattern, is often someone for whom that system never fully engaged their attention. Not because they were less intelligent, but because they were not particularly motivated by the reward the system was offering. And so, sometimes by necessity, sometimes by temperament, they developed a different skill. The skill of operating outside defined parameters, of making decisions without a marking scheme, of being wrong, repeatedly, visibly, consequentially, and continuing anyway. Think about your own career right now. Have you been waiting for someone else's system to tell you that you're succeeding? Because that answer explains more about your bank account than your IQ ever will. Priya said, "That sounds like a nice way of describing people who didn't try hard enough." Arthur said, "I know it does. Because you were trained in a system that defined effort as performance within its own rules. But consider what happens when both people enter the working world. The A-grade student arrives with extraordinary capability and a deeply conditioned need for external validation. They need the grade. They need the performance review. They need to know they are doing it correctly. And so they find systems, companies, firms, organizations, and they perform inside them brilliantly. The C-grade student arrives with a different kind of conditioning. They are not waiting for the grade, because the grade was never reliably coming. They are accustomed to ambiguity, to trying things without knowing in advance if they will work, to defining success themselves, because the institutional definition was never sufficiently motivating. And so, when they encounter the working world, they are more likely to attempt to build something. Not because they are smarter, but because the alternative, performing inside someone else's system for someone else's reward, holds less psychological pull for them. They have been practicing, inadvertently, for exactly what wealth building requires. Tolerating uncertainty while making consequential decisions, without a predetermined answer. Key, Arthur said, here is the specific mechanism, and I want you to hear this clearly. Academic excellence does not just teach you to think well. It teaches you to think well within constraints. And more than that, it teaches you to need constraints in order to feel like you are succeeding. Building a business is entirely open-ended. There is no syllabus. There is no marking scheme. There is no professor who will tell you your approach was correct. There are only results, which arrive slowly, inconsistently, and often for reasons you didn't anticipate. The person who thrived by getting every answer right, validated by an immediate grade, finds this environment structurally uncomfortable. The person who spent years operating without reliable validation finds it more familiar. Write that down, because that sentence explains the gap between you and the person signing your paycheck. Priya said, "So the system that made me excellent also made me afraid to build anything?" Arthur said, "Not afraid. Conditioned. There's a difference. Fear implies you understand the danger. Conditioning is more subtle. You simply reach for the context that produces the feedback you were trained to need. Performance reviews, promotions, titles, all of them are grades by another name. All of them tell you, you did this correctly, and so you keep doing it correctly, for someone else, inside their system, adding value that compounds in their accounts, not yours. Not because you lack the intelligence to build your own, but because your intelligence was never trained to operate without the feedback that building requires you to live without, sometimes for years." Priya said, "The strategy one delivered tonight, the one at the client dinner. It was mostly mine." Arthur said, "And the credit?" Priya said, "The firm's." Arthur said, "Right. Because the firm is the system, and you are performing inside it, brilliantly, in exchange for a salary that is a fraction of the value you are generating. The C-grade student who owns the company you work for did not beat you with intelligence. He beat you with a different relationship to uncertainty. He was willing to build a structure before he knew if it would hold. You were trained to wait until the structure existed, and then perform inside it excellently. Both approaches have value. Only one of them builds wealth." Priya said, "So what do I do with 20 years of conditioning?" Arthur said, You don't undo it. You don't need to. Your ability to think clearly, solve complex problems, communicate precisely, these are genuine assets. The question is not whether to keep them. The question is whether to deploy them inside someone else's system, or begin, gradually, to build your own. Every day you currently ask, how do I perform excellently inside this structure? The question that builds wealth is, what structure could I build that would keep performing even when I am not performing inside it? That one question is worth more than any degree you have ever earned. Priya did not quit her job the next morning. Arthur had not suggested she should. What she did, for the first time in her professional life, was sit down not to solve someone else's problem, but to look clearly at her own. She had spent a decade building expertise in one very specific area, helping mid-sized companies identify operational inefficiencies and design systems to address them. She was genuinely exceptional at it. The firm billed clients at rates she was not allowed to know. She was paid a salary. The gap between those two numbers, the value she generated versus the value she received, had never seemed real to her before. It did now. Not as a grievance. As information. She spent 3 months listing every specific capability she had developed, every type of problem she had solved, every outcome she had generated for clients. Not her job description, her actual demonstrated capability. Then she asked Arthur's question, what structure could I build that would keep performing even when I am not performing inside it? She did not have an immediate answer. She had spent 20 years being trained to find immediate answers. The discomfort of not having one, of sitting with an open-ended question without a marking scheme, was the first real test of whether Arthur's words had actually reached her. She sat with it for 3 months. Then, slowly, imperfectly, with none of the confidence she had always felt submitting excellent work, she began. She took her first independent client, a referral from a former colleague. She undercharged. She knew she had undercharged, but she had charged, which was entirely different from performing inside a firm that charged on her behalf. When the client called 3 months later to say the recommendations had worked, the conversation landed differently than any performance review ever had. Not because the praise was louder, but because it was connected to something she had built, not performed inside. Built. Within 8 months, for independent clients. Not enough to leave the firm, but enough to understand, in her body, not just her mind, what Arthur had been describing. The income from those for clients was not yet significant, but it was doing something her salary had never done. It was building, while she slept, while she was not in the room. 2 years after that Friday evening, Priya left the firm. Not dramatically, not with a speech. She gave 8 weeks' notice. She thanked her manager sincerely, and meant it. He had given her an education in what she was capable of. She just wasn't going to keep doing it for him. By the end of her first year on her own, she had built a consulting practice with a methodology that could be delivered by other consultants she had trained. She remembered the question Arthur had asked her. How many times were you rewarded for being wrong? She had been wrong many times in the past 2 years. Clients she had misjudged. Pricing decisions set incorrectly. One engagement she should never have taken. None of those mistakes had ended her. All of them had taught her something the examination system never could. That being wrong inside your own structure is not failure. It is the tuition fee of building something real. 3 years after that Friday evening, Priya Sharma ran a consulting practice that operated without her being present for every piece of work. She earned more than she had at the firm. She worked fewer hours. She owned what she built. Not because she had gotten smarter. She had always been smart. But because she had finally asked, and slowly answered, a question no examination had ever put in front of her. What can I build that keeps working when I am not in the room? Arthur had said something at the bar that she wrote down the next morning and kept. The A-grade student was trained to find the right answer inside someone else's system. The wealth builder learned, usually the hard way, to build the system first, and then let it find the answers. Here is what I want you to take from this story. If you were excellent at school, if you were the one who got it right, who stayed late, who delivered what was asked precisely and completely, this is not a criticism of you. It is a description of conditioning that is extremely common and almost never examined. Ask yourself honestly, am I performing inside structures I did not build? Am I waiting for someone else's validation before I trust that I have succeeded? Am I generating value that compounds, but not in my own account? And when I imagine building something of my own, does the absence of a clear answer key make me want to gather more information rather than begin? Because if the answer to any of those questions is yes, you are not lacking intelligence. You are not lacking capability. You are carrying conditioning that was built for a system that rewards a different game than the one that builds wealth. And conditioning, unlike intelligence, can be changed. The question is not whether you are smart enough. The question is whether you are willing to be wrong inside something you built long enough for it to become right. If this story made you look at your own intelligence differently, at where it has been pointed and where it could be pointed, that is exactly what this channel is designed to do. Every week we go deeper into the psychology behind why some people build extraordinary wealth and why equally intelligent, equally capable people spend their careers building it for someone else. Subscribe, because the next story might be the one that finally points you in the right direction.